Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. This is Marty Exline with the AT3 Center. Welcome to this webinar in the AT3 Center's ICT Accessibility Series. Today's session is focused on manual website accessibility testing. And I know that many of you also participated in last week's webinar on automated accessibility testing. Without a doubt, our lives have become more and more digitized each of the past few decades, and certainly the pandemic has made it even more so, if that's even possible. We look for our services and we purchase them and our products through more often than ever through the web, so website accessibility has become even more essential than ever. And of course, our presenter last week and today is Lissa Prince with the Oklahoma Able Tech Assistive Technology Program. I did mention during last week's webinar that the recording would be sent out to all participants, and it will go out tomorrow. And then the recording of today's webinar will go out on Tuesday. Both recordings are also going to be available on the AT3 YouTube channel, which is AT3 Center Videos. So go ahead and go to the next slide. If you do want to use the captions, just click on the CC button on the control panel. Please enter your questions or comments in the chat window, and remember to reply to not only the panelists, but also to all the attendees in the chat. As for upcoming events, check in on the at3center.net events page. And then we also send out registration links for the ICT accessibility webinars on the AT3 listserv and also the ICT Community of Practice listserv. And just a reminder, please complete the webinar surveys when you receive them. And with that, I think I'll go ahead and turn it over to Lissa. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Marty. Appreciate it. And I also wanted to add to that, I've already gotten a question in the chat about whether my PowerPoint slides will be available, and they will be available after the webinar. So you should receive that hopefully in addition to recording for if you've registered. So I do include a lot of resources in this one. It's pretty resource heavy, I would say. So hopefully that will ease your mind. You'll have access to that after. All right, so like Marty said, my name is Lissa Prince and I work with Oklahoma Able Tech. So appreciate any of you who came to last week's webinar and are joining me again today. So this is going to look similar to what we did last time. I'm going to start with a poll. We'll move off to a little true or false game, and then we'll move into the actual content. So my first question for you all is, what accessibility issues can you think of that an automated tool cannot check for? So some of you who may have been in last week's webinar have a little bit of a leg up potentially on others who are not, but just kind of pop in the chat what you think may be involved or some of the things that may be involved in manual testing of a website. All right, I'll start reading some of these out as they're coming in. We have proper alt text, color contrast, plain text readability, it's a good one, logical order. Another vote for quality alternative descriptions. Any more? Do all videos have closed captions? Yes, that's a good one. Color contrast again. All right, so a couple more people maybe responding. I'll let you have a couple more seconds to respond, and if not, we'll move on. Video description for videos, yes, like audio description. It's another good one. Got to vote for tables, font readability. All right, so you all are already well on your way to being great manual accessibility testers. So what we'll cover today isn't necessarily a comprehensive list of things to check manually. Instead, what I wanted to focus on is things that we see fairly commonly that really do need a little bit more discussion around how you actually test for them manually. And then also that I can show you how tools can sort of make them easier to test for. So that's kind of where we're headed. But you all had great examples in here. And I will also mention the people who mentioned video accessibility. I don't actually mention that in this one. So I'm glad that you all are already thinking about that, but definitely something you need to check for all the time is closed captions and audio description for videos. So great call on that one. Okay. Get my slideshow activated. There we go. All right, so let's move off into a true or false game. My computer doesn't like to cooperate. I'm actually about to get a new one, so hopefully it decides it's going to act a little nicer after this one. I've had a few gremlins these past few presentations, but anywho. All right, so first question, screen reader testing is the only thing I need to do. Is this true or false? Got some falses in very quickly, so you all are reading my mind. Excellent. Definitely. Well, we'll cover screen reader testing towards the end, but yes, I just wanted to kind of start out with that one. We see this all the time. People say that JAWS, testing with JAWS is actually all you need to do for manual testing, and that one is a big no-no. So you'll see that as we go along. All right, another one, running wave is accessibility testing. Is this true or false? Right, some of you are reading my mind. It's really interesting to see how people react to these questions. So I've got somebody that's actually saying, well, it's a type of accessibility testing, but not all of it. Yes. So in the same vein as screen reader testing is not all you need to do for accessibility testing, running wave is not all you need to do for accessibility testing. And I think even just talking through keyword accessibility will kind of illustrate that. So while wave can tell you a lot of information about your web page, it's not actually even pointing you to everything you need to test. All right, the last one is I have to know code to do accessibility testing. Is this true or false? All right, you guys have figured me out. Excellent. This one's definitely false. So I know that accessibility testing, and I mentioned this a lot in the webinar last week, it can get really overwhelming. There's a lot of technical information coming at you. It's kind of difficult to know when you're done, things like that. But I just wanted to reiterate in this that you do have tools to test, to help you test even on the manual side of things. So while you may have to wrap your mind around some things that seem relatively technical, you still don't need to know what's going on behind the scenes necessarily to actually do accessibility testing. That knowledge might come in handier if you're trying to tell someone how to fix a website. But as far as actually saying, this is what's wrong with the website, you can get away with not knowing much code. So great answers, you guys. All right. So to kind of summarize what we've just covered with our little poll and the true or false questions, manual testing is always going to be necessary. So even if you have an enterprise level tool and it is running over your whole site, or you're even using Wave, Axe, or any of the other types of testing tools out there, there is still some stuff that's just not possible to check with these tools. They can, however, make your testing a little bit quicker. So I would highly recommend just developing a good toolbox of tools to improve the speed and accuracy of your testing. So we're going to cover Wave today and also talk about a bookmarklet that will help you with keyboard testing. And then we will also talk about color contrast analyzer. And these are three that I use all the time in every test, as well as some others too. But we're starting simple here. We're kind of trying to develop your toolbox slowly so that you're not overwhelmed. All right, so what tools can actually help you test for manual accessibility? Again, I'm referring back to the one last week. If you want more information about automated tools, I go a little bit more into detail about how these tools can be used by your level of technical expertise, for instance. So we won't go over that today, just for anybody who's actually been in both of these. And I've already kind of covered which tools we'll cover in this particular session today, but I also wanted to point out that I'm going to show you a little bit about Microsoft Accessibility Insights just for one thing. So not recommending you download it because it's just for one particular thing. But that is one we're going to kind of glance at just for one particular test. Okay, now I did talk about this last week, but I wanted to kind of bring it back up again just so that you hopefully start solidifying more of what you can and can't test for. And so you all had a lot of great answers for this when I asked you the question about what can't be tested with tools. So I'll kind of skip around with some of these, but I didn't see anybody mentioning headings, for instance. So tools can really help you expose that information so that you can actually see what sort of heading structure is or is not on the page, but you're going to have to see if that heading structure makes sense or if any text is actually marked as headings, or sorry, not marked as headings, looks like headings, is actually marked as heading structurally. So the tools can really help with that. I didn't see anyone mention keyboard accessibility, and that is the first thing we will hit. So basically what we're going to make sure of is that all interactive elements can be used via the keyboard, and then a couple of other things. Somebody already mentioned color contrast, so I'll kind of reiterate that color contrast can be tested fairly well by automated tools so long as the text actually has a plain colored background. If the image or, I'm sorry, if there is an image or a gradient behind that text, those tools aren't going to be able to determine what the two colors it's testing are, so then it won't do much good for you. So there is a lot of manual testing that needs to be done on color contrast. You all got alternative text. I saw some table commentary, so you're covered on that front. And then we're going to cover forms a little bit today. So forms testing can actually take quite a bit of time, but I just wanted to at least leave you with a few pointers today to get you started on how to test forms for accessibility. All right, so like I said, let's start with keyboard testing. And I also think I failed to mention, I'm going to be pausing here and there for questions, and I'm going to also be bouncing between my PowerPoint and the websites we're looking at a little bit more today. So I hope that doesn't get too confusing, but I will be pausing kind of after keyboard testing and then at various points so you can ask questions and they don't get lost in the context of something else. So just so you all know what to expect there. All right, so there are about 3 things we need to consider when we think about keyboard accessibility testing. And those are, first off, that, and this is the first sentence is kind of technical, but the idea is that everything that is interactive is reachable and usable via the keyboard. So I can actually access everything if I do not have the use of my mouse. So that can be things like buttons or links, or if you think even more interactive types of things like accordions or a carousel. We need to make sure that all pieces of technology on the site that we can click with the mouse are also keyboard accessible. Then the next thing we need to make sure of is that the tab order actually matches the reading order. So if we're looking through the page and we see that, you know, this link is ahead of this one kind of in the structure visually, we need to make sure that as we're, and I'll talk more about tab order as we kind of get into our examples, but we need to make sure that the order we're reaching those interactive elements in does match the visual reading order. And then the last thing is that we need to make sure that there is a way for us to see where we are on the page. So this applies to users who are using the keyboard to navigate without anything else. They actually may not have access to the mouse, whatever it may be. We're trying to let them know where they are on the page. Otherwise, they may be activating a link and not really meaning to. So it can get really, really confusing if that one tiny thing isn't there. So this is one that has a super big impact on usability. All right. I wanted to briefly touch on this, and I've also included a link for this. If you're interested, you can go read more about it later. But there are some things we need to think about in terms of how we activate these particular interactive elements. So links should be activated using enter. Buttons can be activated using enter or space if they're properly coded. Radio buttons and checkboxes are chosen using arrow keys and spacebar. So those are kind of those are the things to keep in mind as we sort of go through our examples, that's sort of how you're trying to actually get these activated and what the pattern should be for how these are used. Another thing that I wanted to include as part of keyboard testing that isn't necessarily kind of related to those 3 points I kind of started out with, but is still really important, skip navigation. The rule on skip navigation, and for those of you who aren't familiar with skip navigation, it's just a link or a button that's sort of towards the top of the page. It either needs to be the first element after the address bar, kind of before the navigation, or really soon after. So it needs to be one of the first things a user encounters as they're navigating through the page with the keyboard. So at the bare minimum, the skip navigation link needs to be visible on keyboard focus. Some people may choose to actually have this visible at all times, but I feel like it's more common, based on design requirements or whatever, to see the skip navigation actually only visible on keyboard focus. So another thing, and this may sound really silly, but your skip navigation needs to work. So we've actually seen cases where there is a skip navigation present, but because it's not properly linked to the content area that's below the navigation, it's not actually functional. So some tools can catch that for you, but really this is something that you need to just test yourself and make sure you're hitting that skip navigation, activating it, and making sure that the focus is then put down in the main content area. Now, another fun thing we see somewhat often is that skip navigation sometimes has bad color contrast. So because it's not visible all the time, a designer may not think to actually incorporate good color contrast here. So we see this, unfortunately, a little more often than you would expect. So those are some things to think about on skip navigation specifically. I wanted to touch briefly on flyouts too. So flyouts are those big menus that you see at the top of a website, the main navigation area. And if you, hover over them, or theoretically speaking, keyboard into them, they should actually be able to open up. And then there are these really large menus. I have an example I wanted to show you. But the idea I wanted to think about with this one is, we may be able to get these to where they're accessible, where you can actually activate them with the enter key or the space bar, depending upon how they function. But are they actually usable? Are they going to present complications for someone who is keyboard navigating into them? So that may not be a keyboard test fail necessarily, but it's something we like to point out because they can present some pretty large challenges. All right, so let's talk tools for a second. So the tools that I primarily would recommend using for keyboard testing are first off your keyboard. So again, I know that sounds kind of silly, but that's the bulk of what you'll be using. And then we also have the Force Focus bookmarklet. And I'll show you briefly how to install that one if it's helpful for anybody. So actually, go ahead and vote if you want me to show you how to install a bookmarklet. If not, then I can just kind of skip over it and save some time. So again, in the chat, just pop in. I saw a hand raise, so I suppose that will mean I will show it. That's all good. Okay, great. And then some testing tools I use for tab order specifically are Microsoft Accessibility Insights or ARC Toolkit. So I'll definitely show you Accessibility Insights. I may not show you ARC Toolkit because they kind of do the same thing. But if you're interested in ARC Toolkit, that's also something that shows you tab order in a unique way. All right, so let's move over to, went to the wrong one, sorry, to our testing sites. And I am going to pop, I have way too many bookmarks at the top of my page. So I'm going to pop this link in the chat. And this link is a link to the University of Washington Accessible University site. They have both this version that is completely inaccessible, and then they have one that is accessible. And I can go ahead and put that link in for you as well. So this is what we'll be using to demonstrate some of these tools. Okay. Now, what I wanted to show you was the bookmarklet. So the ones that there are tons of bookmarklets, by the way, too, and you can get completely overwhelmed, like I sort of mentioned last week, with the amounts of tools that are out there. But this series of bookmarklets, I feel like, is pretty comprehensive. So you can mix and match and use different bookmarklets from different creators. But I really like Paul J. Adams. So I'm going to pop this link in the chat for anyone who did not get the link to the document I had up earlier. And what I'd like to show you, and unfortunately, it's a little complicated to add these via keyboard. So just for the sake of time, I'm not going to I'll show you adding these via keyboard. It requires a little JavaScript copy pasting. And if you're interested in adding those at any other time, these are the link for the article that explains all of that is going to be in this slideshow. So you will have access to that. But the bookmarklet that we want to use right now is the force focus one. He has a demo page here as well, if you would like to go look at that. But and I'll go ahead and do that just because I know it looks a little bit funky. So I will admit he doesn't have the best, I can't think of the word I was trying to say. It's not the best visual here, but this at least will kind of give you some installation instructions and some things like that. So what I would like to show you, though, is just how to actually get it added. So if you take your mouse and just kind of put it over focus bookmarklet, you can actually click and drag it. So click, hold, and then drag it, and you'll just take it directly up to your toolbar. And then that will be how you actually activate it from the bookmarks bar. Now, if you don't have the bookmarks bar activated, that should be something that you can kind of right click on your toolbar and show bookmarks bar or something like that. And that should work in both Chrome and Firefox. And I'm in Chrome, just an FYI. So anything I show you will be in Chrome, but all of the tools that we're using today can be used in Firefox and Chrome, except for Microsoft Accessibility Insights. All right, so does anyone need me to repeat that? Like I said, it's a longer process to get it added via the keyboard, so I apologize if anybody needs that. I do not mean to leave you out. It's a little bit difficult to show. Not getting any requests for repeat, so we'll go ahead and move on. And I do have a question. Tell me about the purple circle highlighting your cursor. I have that on just for showing where my mouse is, because my mouse is kind of small. I have some display issues with this computer in particular, so I can't really get the mouse cursor to look very big. So that's why I have that there. I hope it shows you better where I'm pointing, since this is a pretty demonstration heavy webinar. And the tool that the ring around the mouse is actually called SwordSoft. It's a free. I think they might have a paid version, but yeah, that if you're interested, it's called SwordSoft, like swordfish, but soft instead. Okay. So I'm going to close out of that. And then we're going to go back to our Accessible University demo site. And this is the one that is inaccessible. So it should, in the URL for it, it should say before.html. The web address for it, it should say before.html. If you're on that one, you're on the right one. Okay. So I've kind of covered what we're expecting out of keyboard testing and kind of the things that we're looking for. So we're just going to start doing that now, hands-on, one by one, just so that you can get an idea of how to actually perform this and practice it. Thank you, John, for putting that link in there for SwordSoft. Appreciate that. It's always funny what questions people ask during webinars. I love it. Okay, so what I'm going to do first, and this is just so all of you know, when we get a website in to review, this is the first thing that we'll do, because we often find the keyboard accessibility, if it's not been considered, then that's typically a pretty good indicator that this company or organization or whoever we're testing this website for hasn't considered accessibility, unfortunately. All right, so what we're going to do is put our cursor up into the address bar. and then we will start actually using the tab key to start testing our keyboard accessibility. So I'm going to hit my tab key, and I am so sorry that nothing's going to seem to happen for a minute, but that's by design. So I'm hitting the tab key once more. I'm about 3 times in now. Now I'm about 4, 5, and then now we move down the page. So what I can see from this is that something is happening. I'm actually navigating through the page, but remember that third checkpoint we kind of talked about, visual focus indicator. We're not seeing that. We don't know where we are. So that's where that force focus bookmarklet comes in handy. So once you have it activated, added to your bookmarks bar, you can just activate it by clicking on it or just hitting enter on it if you're using your keyboard. And that will actually turn on a little box that appears now around the link that we're currently located on. So what this is allowing us to do is to now test the other elements we need to test for keyboard accessibility. But we're also at this point, we've logged an issue. This issue is that there is no visible focus indicator for this particular website. So we've already found issue number 1 in our manual testing. All right, so now that we have that activated, what I wanted to do is actually show from the start. So I'm going to put my cursor back into the address bar, get the focus in there, and then I'm going to start tabbing again. So now this should look different. You see that we hit the About main menu item, the Academics main menu item, Admissions, Visitors, and then we move to this little image that's in the slideshow. And after that, we go down to a click here link that we were on before. So I'm going to go back up a little bit. Does anyone notice anything that was missed in our keyboard order as we were going through this testing? Let's put you all on the spot. Oh, yeah, I think I might have confused. I didn't get all the way to the form. I just kind of stopped midway through the page. Drop down for the navigation. So I've got somebody saying that it missed the previous and next buttons for the carousel. It missed the logo. Tabs at the top. Okay. All right. Looks like some of you caught on, so well done. And I apologize, I did confuse everyone, I think. Let me go down here. So starting from the click here, if I finish out testing the page, it does get to the form. So it does actually get all the way through that. And I'm just so familiar with this, I kind of forget that people aren't occasionally. So it does actually catch everything except what is in the top part of the page, like in the carousel, and somebody caught the navigation, so good job there. I'm also getting someone that's saying skip navigation. Yes, there is no skip navigation. So at this point, we've logged a couple of more issues, right? The issues that we've logged are that there is no skip navigation for this site. And then another thing that that somebody mentioned, I think it was John, these previous and next buttons, they're not reachable via the keyboard. So they will also not be usable via the keyboard. So we have 2 things to check. If we can get to it, that's great, but it still needs to be used. So this one already fails that first one. These buttons cannot be reached via the keyboard. And the same thing goes for these. So if I hover over them with my mouse, you'll see that we turn into a little clicky hand. And that indicates that this is actually clickable and should also therefore be keyboard accessible. Now, I wanted to point out some other answers were like the apply now. So, and then accessible university. So accessible university is an image. It's not actually clickable. It's not interactive. So that doesn't actually need to be keyboard accessible. The same thing goes for the apply now text. This should just be maybe a heading. It shouldn't actually be keyboard accessible, but the form field should have been. So I'm not sure which things and people were meaning with that. Maybe you just meant the whole form. And if that's the case, that was great. You caught that. But just wanted to point out non-interactive elements don't need to be keyboard tested or keyboard accessible. Okay. So at this point, what we've logged is that we're missing a visible focus indicator. We have links and buttons in the carousel that are missing, that are not keyboard accessible. And then someone also caught this, but we have submenu items under here. So let me do this one more time. I'm going to put my focus kind of by that logo so we can go directly into the navigation. If I hit enter, it doesn't actually open the submenu. If I hit the down key, it doesn't. If I hit the space bar, it doesn't. It actually scrolls down the page. So these submenu items are absolutely not keyboard accessible. So this is often something you have to kind of play around and find. So, take your mouse and sort of hover over things and make sure there's actually not something that you're missing that should be interactive, because those kinds of things are easy to miss. Okay. I also wanted to show you the Flyouts, and this is and I hate to pick on, I picked on an Oklahoma site since we're in Oklahoma, and this is an example of Flyout menus that are technically accessible because you can open them via the keyboard, but I just wanted to kind of ask that question about whether or not they're usable. So what I'm going to do is actually get my focus down kind of a little bit closer, and you'll notice I'm doing that sometimes. If I'm familiar with the site or whatever, I'll actually just kind of put my mouse cursor focus in a place so that I can just get through things more quickly with the keyboard, since we're trying to focus on one thing. So that's what I'm doing there, just if anybody caught that and was curious. Sometimes it doesn't work though, so I'm actually still going through everything. So when I got to For Oklahomans, it opened up this massive menu on its own. So this menu is covering up most of the page. So anybody who's using the keyboard is now going to have to actually go through each of these one by one in order to get to the next menu item, which is For Libraries up at the top. So this is where I wanted to actually show you a little bit about tab order as well. So I'm going to activate my Microsoft Accessibility Insights. And this is just a Chrome plugin. Unfortunately, they don't have it available for Firefox. I think it's also on Edge, but it'll actually let you show tab stops. And this tool is really neat. So I've activated that. Now what I wanted to show you is I'm going to put my cursor back in the address bar and kind of start tabbing through again. And it's going to start putting some numbers on the page for us. So what it's doing is actually showing us how many tab stops there are. And so when I say tab stop, I do mean if I hit my tab key and it stops on something, that's what we consider a tab stop. So that may sound technical, but it's pretty self-explanatory when you think about it. All right, so if I keep going, and I'm just gonna kind of let it ride. So see how many tab stops we get. Just to get to For Libraries, it took us 59 tab stops. So again, this menu is actually accessible because it can be accessed via the keyboard, but do we really want to put someone through all of this work just to get to the top level menu items, like the main areas of the site that you want your users to go to? So speaking in terms of whether this is like a pass or fail, this wouldn't necessarily be a direct fail because our standards say things must be keyword accessible, but it doesn't necessarily say that you need to limit the number of tab stops. So we'll actually include this kind of as a best practice as opposed to a direct fail. But I did want to kind of show you that's something we see fairly often, and it can really trip users up who maybe are using a switch device and that's functioning as that tab key, and gets very fatiguing potentially. So something to really keep in mind. And let's see, I've got a question. All right, so could you repeat the name of the plugin? The plugin that I was just using is Microsoft Accessibility Insights, and it's a Chrome plugin. And I have it linked in the PowerPoint as well, so you can go download it directly from that link when you get the PowerPoint. But this tool, Accessibility Insights is another testing tool. It has a lot more functionality than this, but I think it and Arc Toolkit are the only two that actually show you tab stops kind of like this visually. And we actually like to use this too if we're ever trying to hand someone a report. This can really illustrate very quickly for someone who's sighted, of course, how many tab stops there are. So it's a really good tool we found to actually just kind of show that impact on what your number of tab stops can do. And it can also help you if you see anything that's out of tab order, which I kind of actually failed to get to. The Accessible University doesn't actually have incorrect tab order, but this one does. So if you look at the numbers, we go from 1 to 2 over here. It's like a little link at the top. And let me zoom in. It might not work very well if I zoom in. Okay, the numbers are staying with me though, so that's good. We go to 2 and then we go 3, 4, 5 from right to left instead of left to right. So this would actually fail on tab order. So it's actually got an incorrect tab order because that the order that we tabbed through the page in is not actually matching the visible reading order. Okay. So while the Accessible University site did not have an example of that, this one did. So now that should complete your idea of keyboard accessibility testing. All right, does anyone have any questions on that? And I'm getting a question kind of about whether this before is accessible or not. So if we run wave over it, which we'll do here shortly, you'll see that there's actually a lot wrong with it. But yeah, the bookmark tool is not going to show that, unfortunately. So, yeah. All right, anybody have any questions on keyboard accessibility before we move on? I think we're good then. All right, so let's go back to our PowerPoint. And now I want to touch on color use and contrast. So really quickly, color usage is basically checking to make sure that nothing is conveyed using color by itself. So for instance, if you think of things like required fields are in red. So if someone can't actually discern that the red color is maybe different from the rest of the paragraph text that's in black on the page, then this is not going to be helpful in letting them know what required fields are and how they need to fill out this form. Click the green button is another one. So if someone who is colorblind, it may be up to a green button next to a red button. This user isn't going to have any idea which one to click. So we want to make sure and avoid using color alone to convey any information. And then for color contrast, kind of gone over this a few times, so I won't cover too much more about it in terms of the background color piece, but I did want to kind of see if anybody has any other situations that they know of where we might actually need to test contrast. So skip navigation was one, and that should give you a hint because it's kind of interactive potentially, and it shows up on keyword focus. So does anyone have any other ideas about when color contrast may need to be tested manually? Color of clicked hyperlink, that's a really good one, yes. Text on images, yes. And text on images, I will say too, it's important to test kind of all the variations of color. So if you have a lot of, like a tree, you may want to test on the brown of the bark versus the green of the leaves and make sure you're testing all, potential possibilities for that image. Of course, you can also just solve that in other ways, but if you're testing, yeah. Any other ideas? I think Christina was onto something with the clicked hyperlink. That's a good one. All right. Well, then I will just talk. So some other things we need to think about in terms of color contrast are when things are moused over or when they're actually receiving keyboard focus. Things can actually change color. So that is another area where we need to test. And I've listed some color testing tools. So Color Contrast Analyzer is one that is really great for any manual testing. I'll also show you briefly Chrome Developer Tools Checker. So I won't go too much into detail on it. There are lots of articles about how to use it, but it's a really good one if you are technical leaning at all. If you're not, then I will show you another method. So don't worry about that. Okay, let's move back over into our testing site. And what I wanted to show you, if we run Wave, it will actually find some color contrast issues. So the color contrast it's picking up right now is this about, let me not hover over it. It's like a gray text with on a beige background. So what that is doing is actually testing those two colors. Now, when I hovered over it, you could see that the color now changes from gray on like a beige to purple and white. So the tools cannot activate act like they're mouse clicking or hovering with the mouse or keyboarding into something. So they're not actually going to be able to test these interactive sort of things or that activated link either necessarily, depending upon if that's what you've got on the page or not. So this is where you really need to think through all the iterations of your design and think about, what colors do I have together in this scenario? Like when I'm using my mouse to hover over it or when I'm keyboarding into it. So this is where you can actually use Chrome developer tools, or if you're not comfortable with that, you can just take a screenshot. So what I actually do, I used to use Snipping Tool, but now I have Snagit. So you can actually just open Snipping Tool, take a screenshot of this, and go from there. Now, sometimes it doesn't always work. It doesn't let you keep highlights, but that is an option. You can also do print screen, and that will make sure you actually keep the highlight. Now, my print screen key actually opens my Snagit, but and also I really love Snagit. So if it's something that you can afford and you do a lot of testing like this, it could be something that can really help you with this kind of color contrast testing. All right, so how you activate this and test it with the Chrome developer tools. Now, I'm going to right click on About and go to Inspect. And this is going to bring up all the codey stuff that some of you may not want to see, but we're going to ignore most of it. The only thing we want to do is go into our styles pane, and we want to find the color of the text, basically. So it's this gray right here. So I know this is really small. I can't really zoom in on this part, so I apologize. But what it should do is actually pull up contrast information. But the problem with this is it's actually a gradient. So that beige behind it is a gradient. So it's not actually going to be able to test for us. So that's where we can actually get contrast information on what's actually activated right now. Now, if we want to change that, we hit this little hover button, and this is toggling what state it's in. So to get back to where we were with the mouse, it's just the hover, and we'll actually, we can see that now it's changed to our purple and white combination. And then we could go back down to our color, and we should be able to check it. But again, this is apparently a gradient, so it's not working. My demonstration did not go super well, and I apologize. But this is also a good way for you to activate the state that you need to test it in if like your screenshot tool isn't working and it's just taking a screenshot of what it is otherwise. But those are a lot of situations where we don't see people knowing that they need to test. So, and this happens on buttons, it happens on links, it sometimes happens in form fields. So it's just a really good idea to play with the site and see what color changes are happening and make sure you need to test those as well. Okay. And yes, I've got a question on Snagit. Yes, so that's the tool. It's by TechSmith. And Doran actually said tooltips too, or something that changes color, and you may need to test for color contrast there as well. And that's a really good example. Thank you, Doran. Okay. Now I wanted to cover forms, and the other stuff I can just kind of go through more quickly. So forms are, like I said, fairly complicated to test depending upon the situation. The one that we're going to test with is pretty simple, so hopefully it doesn't get too confusing. But basically, a good way to test a form is to just submit it empty. And this is going to tell you a lot of information pretty quickly. So again, I'm just going to summarize. You have these slides for reference, but are the users actually given notice that there are errors? So like if there are required fields, or is the user actually told, hey, those were required and here's which ones you need to go fix? So that's what we're mainly looking for, is that the user is notified of errors and kind of given information on how to fix them. And then our instructions provided. So are the required fields noted in an accessible way? So not using color alone, for instance. And then are the formats actually in the field? So like if it's a date field and you need month, dash, day, dash, year, or something like that, you would want to make sure that that's actually provided in the label or connected via ARIA, which I don't have time to get into today. But those are pretty important things. And then lastly, you can also see if a screen reader user is notified of errors. So that is a newer checkpoint they actually added in WCAG 2.1. In 2.0, it didn't have its own success criteria, but now it does. So there's that. We'd like to do that testing to make sure those are done. I've included a link for easy checks for forms to kind of give you a more comprehensive look at how to test forms. But we're going to go kind of do an example here shortly. And there's a tip there for you, which should show you, which I'll also show you by hand. So one thing we can do with this form is actually hit the submit button, like I mentioned, and just see what it does. So it says your form has errors. Please correct them and resubmit. Now what happened was that this error was kind of put at the top, which is totally fine, but it doesn't tell us which fields are incorrect. And it also doesn't, we aren't testing with a screen reader right now, but I can almost guarantee you that this wasn't actually announced via screen reader when it popped up. So a user of that technology is going to have to go all the way back up, try to figure out why their form wasn't actually submitted, and then at this point try to guess to see which fields are actually required, because there's no method for them to know which fields are required. Now, those of us who can see, it's very slight, but name and email are blue. But again, that's using color alone, so that's what we don't want to do. So this failed on several things. We have a color use issue. We have an error message that doesn't actually let users know what to fix. So this is not providing enough information on how to actually get the issues corrected so the form can be submitted. And I also wanted to point out, I don't think I pointed this out, but there is a list of issues. So somewhere down the page, there's actually a list of issues so you can see what all issues are wrong with this whole site. So again, I couldn't cover everything today, but that's there for you if you want to use it. And we also use this all the time, not only in training, just for testing tools and things like that too. So it's a really great resource to have for you. And got somebody saying, or using a symbol like an asterisk. So let me move over. The accessible version of the site actually shows you a better example. So an asterisk is pretty well known, so we don't necessarily call that a fail if an asterisk is the only thing used to denote that a field is required. But it's still better if you can to just kind of spell it out. So again, that's sort of a best practice we have. There's also a way to programmatically add that to the field, which is another thing that they've added in 2.1, WCAG 2.1. But yes, you can use an asterisk. It's just not best practice. Good question. Okay. Back to my PowerPoint. Oh, and I didn't actually cover my little tip. So if you are doing any keyboard testing, like if you run Wave, you can actually see pretty quickly that the form fields don't actually have properly associated labels. That's what all of these are. Missing form label is the error that it comes up with. So this tip wouldn't work for that. If we go over to Accessible University and you're kind of just, clicking through a site, navigating through a site, and this is unfortunately not available with the keyboard, it's just with the mouse. But if you click on it, the label that's next to the form field, and it actually goes into, your cursor moves into that form field, those labels are properly associated. And that's gonna allow assistive technology to actually have a name for these form fields. So that's what we want. So again, I'm going to click on email, this label, and then my cursor moves directly into that form field. So that's how we know they're properly connected. So that's a fun little tip that you can use if you have access to a mouse. And it can prevent you from having to run the tools at first. You can sort of see as you're just kind of navigating through the site before you get all that junk that the tools will put on the site for you. So you don't have to kind of get around that. All right, back to my slideshow. We only have about 9 more minutes, so and I'm going to kind of cover this stuff pretty quickly. So proper heading usage, I've kind of mentioned a few times. So the wave tool will actually show you the outline. I kind of showed you that already, so that you can see what heading structure is there and then try to determine if that's accurate. You know, is everything that looks like a heading marked as a heading according to wave? There are bookmarklets that do that same thing. So I sent you all the link for Paul J. Adams bookmarklets. He has a headings bookmarklet that you can activate if you don't want to go through the process of getting all the wave stuff run and having all of that there and potentially, you know, overwhelming you with as much as there is on the page. A descriptive alternative text. So you're checking to see if an image has alternative text. Should it actually have alternative text, or should it be marked as what we call null? And that would mean that it's marked as decorative kind of in the HTML. And the tools will help you know if it's actually got true alternative text or if it's marked as null. If the image does have alternative text, is it actually descriptive? Does it actually convey the information the image is trying to convey? So again, you can use wave or a bookmarklet, and these are going to actually show what that alternative text is so that you can not only see if it's there, but just check to make sure it's accurate. So that's where the tool is actually helping you do the manual check as well. It's providing that information for you so you don't have to go into the code and see what that alternative text is and decide at that point. Another thing we always need to test is zooming. So to make sure that for anybody who's using Zoom technology like Zoom text or anything like that, that the content can be zoomed in without things overlapping or becoming completely inaccessible off the page or something like that. So there you need to test both ways, like zooming all the content, which is on the keyboard, it's just Control+ or Control-, and that'll zoom in all your content, and that works on all browsers. You also need a test, where you're zooming in just on the text itself. So not zooming all the content, just zooming the text. Firefox has a built-in tool for that. And you can actually follow the link in this presentation, and it'll show you how to do that. But Chrome needs a plugin. So I wanted to illustrate that one really quickly so that you can sort of see the difference. So I'm on the Accessible University accessible version. And if I use Control+, I'm going to zoom in on all the content. So you can see that we have the logos kind of there, the navigation's left, the carousel, and everything's kind of funneling down from there. Now I'm going to reset that. And then I'm going to use my Zoom text only, which it has keyboard shortcuts as well, but I'll show you what it looks like without those. If you zoom in, let's see, we'll just zoom to 200%. And you can see that it just kind of functions a little bit differently. The content didn't get resized so that the apply now form is below anything. So they just function differently, and you do need to test both of those. But that's where a tool can really come in handy, because otherwise, I don't know how you would test that one. Okay. And then last thing I wanted to cover was just briefly screen reader testing. And now you may be wondering why I'm not actually demoing a screen reader. Well, I'm not exactly a proficient screen reader user. I know enough to do my job as a tester, but I would not say I'm actually fantastic about using a screen reader. So I really hesitate to do any demonstrations just because I'm not an actual user of a screen reader. But they are really useful if you can get used to them, just for testing out interactive elements and forms in particular. And you can also sort of just make sure you're not missing something that's maybe not visible or something like that. They're really good at kind of finding hidden things sometimes. And of course, we discussed in our true or false game, it's not all you need to do. Screen reader testing is great, but it's not the only thing that you need to test. Now, you can use two tools. I would recommend NVDA or JAWS, of course. Now, between those two, we typically like to use NVDA more for testing because it actually doesn't try to assume things or interpret things as much as JAWS does. Like JAWS is very good about sort of trying to anticipate what the content is trying to convey, and we'll kind of make guesses. But NVDA gives you a little bit more of a straight experience. So we really recommend that one more for testing. It's free, but it also takes donations. So if you're willing to give a donation, I'm sure they would much appreciate it. Now, again, I'm not an expert screen reader user by any means, but there are a couple of resources that have helped me. DQ has a list of screen reader shortcuts as well as TPGI. So you can actually look at those and get a good idea for how to use both NVDA and JAWS from both of those resources. And lastly, I wanted to kind of sum up everything by saying that, I couldn't cover all of the tests that you need to do in this particular webinar or in the one previous. So I wanted to leave you with a list of checklists that you can refer back to. So, of course, these checklists are going to provide you with the whole series of checks you need to do for web accessibility. And then you would need to make sure and kind of think through all the stuff you've hopefully learned about whether you want to use this tool or that tool, and use some of the techniques we talked about today for the manual side. And that should at least get you started on an accessibility testing process. So I've included quite a few. The W3C Easy Checks and the WebAIM Evaluation Quick Reference are the two that I would recommend start with potentially if you're brand new to this, because they kind of approach it on a more smaller scale level. And then beyond that, I've got ALI projects, WebAIMs, one from 18F GSA, and then DQs. And then lastly, I've included a link to an article by Eric Bailey, who's a designer, pretty popular in the accessibility world, and he's got a really great article on manual testing. If you have been intrigued by any of what we've talked about here today, he's got a great article on manual testing as a whole. So, okay. So now I have just a couple minutes for questions, but I wanted to turn it back over to Marty in case he would like to close it out. And I'm happy to stay on for questions after that.
Yeah, thank you. Excuse me, I did want to mention that the next webinar in the ICT accessibility series will be on the topic of accessibility and technology purchase and use decisions. So it'll focus on issues surrounding how we make sure that our vendor partners understand how critical it is for digital materials to be accessible, and explore some of the tools out there that can help. And that's going to be on July 14th at 2:30 Eastern. So kind of mark your calendars for that. And other than that, we'll just go ahead and let you take any questions that anybody has.
Sounds good. It looks like we have a couple in the chat. So, so I've got a question on using both an automated and manual testing. What would be an average time to check the accessibility of a website? That is a good question. You'll hear a lot of estimates from different companies. I've heard anywhere from between like an hour to 3 hours to test a page. So if that tells you anything, it can really range. And it also is going to depend on the type of content that you have on the page. So the way we do our testing, it's primarily like a component-based approach. So we'll pick off the header, we'll pick off the footer, any sidebars, things like that, stuff that's consistent across multiple pages. And then we'll also test things like accordions, like, that are sort of used in various places throughout a site. So then that really just leaves content. So again, our testing is a little bit different than some estimates you hear. So I would say, like, plan for at least an hour per page if you're going to do it that way. Same thing for a component. If you're testing out an accordion, to actually go through and test with the automated tool and then with the manual, it's potentially going to take an hour a component. So or longer again. So we always try to really overestimate, just because we really don't know what we're going to get into. Like, we can do as much pre-investigation as we think is necessary, but it's just not always going to find everything, and we still could get surprised. So yeah, hope that answered your question. It's kind of an it depends, and I know that's stinky to do, but we in the accessibility profession really love to do that. It's one of our favorite things, I think. And I've got a Doran is actually suggesting JAWS Inspect. So that is a tool that actually shows what a screen reader output would be. So if you're not actually comfortable using a screen reader, it can help you sort of bridge the gap between the two. I can't remember about how much it costs, but yeah, I've heard great things about that tool as well. So thank you for suggesting that. And then, so an add-on to the estimation question, does the estimate include writing down the notes for reporting issues? Yeah, we try to include that. So I think that's why the estimates can get so high. So I would say our reporting process is a little bit differently. So I will log all of the issues kind of in a spreadsheet as I'm doing the actual testing. So that estimate includes getting the issues logged in a spreadsheet. It doesn't necessarily include us putting all of that information into a report. We basically copy paste everything from Excel into Word. So we'll do a separate estimation just for the report building. But I would say, yes, the hour to 3 hour kind of estimate would probably indicate that they're logging the actual issues rather than just finding them. And some actually would also include remediation advice. We don't do that as much in our reviews anymore, and could have a whole conversation about that. But yeah. What other questions do you have? Oh, and I didn't, my email address is listed there, but I will pop it in the chat if anybody wants to communicate with me after. I know for me, when I'm watching presentations, I hardly ever think of questions. It's always right after. So feel free to let me know if you have questions. And if no one has any other questions, for those of you who are still on, I really appreciate the time. I know this stuff can get really intense and difficult, but thank you for hanging in with me. And I hope you learned a little something. So thank you.